Ladies and gentlemen, Stacey Abrams!
Now let's go get it done. Use the young people of the United States of America to pave a road that will last forever. I will not concede because the erosion of our democracy is not right. The machinery of democracy should work for everyone, everywhere. We need him to tell the truth.
Thank you so much. So this is a woman with big decisions to make. So let's just hope we can help her make them today, right? So let's cut to the chase. If you were to run for president, which of the male candidates would you have as your VP?
I'm willing to give them all a shot, as well as women candidates. I'm going to look at everyone.
Good, I love that. I love the will part of that. So let's pretend that you are, again, a presidential candidate. How are you going to beat Trump? How do you beat him?
You don't beat Trump, and I think that's the wrong frame. When you go into any intention trying to defeat someone else, then you're going to lose because you're automatically playing by their game, you're using their narrative, you're trying to undo what they've done, which means you're not doing yours. I believe that you run a campaign, you run a business, you run an organization with your end in mind, telling people what you will do, why you're the one to do it. And I think it's important for us to understand Trump did not win because he was a good candidate. He won because 70,000 people voted in 3 states because of the Electoral College, but 6 million people stayed home. And the reality is, we have an opportunity to overcome voter suppression, overcome strategic error. There are a whole host of things that led to his victory, none of which are insurmountable. And so winning does not mean beating Trump, it means winning America. That's our mission.
So
getting rid of him is just a byproduct.
So what do you say to those who think that the Democratic Party is moving so far left that it's actually going to alienate those very rural workers, voters, that you did such a great job of winning over in Georgia?
This is, again, it's this false narrative that it gets set first by those who are actually on the far right, and then it gets repeated by punditry until it sounds like truth. Having access to health care is not a leftist idea, it's a human idea. We've been talking about it since Truman. And having access to a planet that still exists is a pretty basic thing we want. Making enough money to take care of your family, working full-time and earning a wage that lets you take care of your family, that's economic security. These are not leftist ideas. These are progressive ideas, meaning we are moving forward from where we are, where you don't have access to health care, where you can't make a living with your job. And so I think we have to stop buying into this notion that because it is different than now, it is somehow normatively outside the box. We are asking for basic human rights to be made whole and real in the United States. There is nothing un-American about it. In fact, it is exactly who we are supposed to be.
Well, I mean, for all of your extraordinary firepower, Stacey, at 45 years old, at the sort of top of your game, you're benched, right? I mean, it was so close to the election in Georgia. And as you watch all the sort of cruelty and chaos unfold right now in this immigration chaos, what are your solutions to this? I mean, as you're sitting and watching this.
Well, I don't sit and watch. I mean, part of what I've always tried to do is operate on multiple fronts. So yes, I was in the state legislature, I was the Democratic leader, but I also founded the New Georgia Project to register more than 300,000 voters. I was an entrepreneur. I was an entrepreneur who helped move capital to small businesses, primarily women and minority-owned businesses. I don't think you relegate yourself to one space to operate. You certainly get more attention depending on where you stand, but my responsibility is to never stop fighting, and I've always tried to be a tri-sector leader, nonprofit sector, for-profit sector, and the public sector, because we have to pay attention to all three. We can't cede any territory.
Well, let's go back to that election last year that the whole country watched so closely. What really galvanized you to run for the leadership in Georgia that hasn't elected a Democrat to run the state in 15 years and hasn't elected a black woman for the job, ever?
The U.S. is a little bit behind on this. Look, I grew up in Mississippi. I like to say I was Mississippi raised and Georgia grown. And I grew up in poverty, not the abject poverty of some, but the grinding working class poverty that so many people know, where your parents work full time, do exactly what they're supposed to, and still struggle to make ends meet. And because of that, I grew up watching my parents do good work. They were engaged in social service. They would take us out to volunteer. And I would ask, I know that we're good people and we're supposed to do this, but we can't save Mississippi with 6 kids and my good parents. And my mom and dad said, well, the larger responsibility is government. And that really grabbed me, this notion that there is a structure that should be doing this work, not of fixing every problem, but removing barriers to opportunity and solving problems that should be solved, because the macro solution is more effective than the micro solution. That led me to running for governor. But the intentionality of my campaign was to know that Georgia is a different state than it was 50 years ago. And we had to bring voices into the process who were being left out, people of color, marginalized communities, and rural whites, progressive whites. We had to build a new coalition, and it worked.
Yeah, but I mean, after all those years of work that you did to register new voters, I mean, to lose by just 2 percentage points and then see 53,000 people blocked from voting, the majority of people of color, how much did that piss you off?
So I'm going to correct a few numbers.
Okay, sorry about
that. So it was 1.4%.
Okay, better still.
I'm a tax attorney, so I like the lower end of that. And let's put into full context what Secretary of State Brian Kemp, now governor, did. He purged more than 1.5 million voters. He held 53,000 voters hostage on this pending list using a system that a federal judge said was racially discriminatory and had disproportionate effect on women. He closed 214 polling places. And if you're a person who doesn't have a car and you try to go and vote and they've moved your polling place from a mile away from your house to 10 miles away, you can't vote. We had waiting lines that were up to 4 hours in largely African American communities. And we had absentee ballots that were rejected at some of the highest rates in the nation for what's called a signature mismatch, meaning that your signature did not match when you signed up to vote or your driver's license. My signature doesn't match from Kroger to CVS. And so to say that he simply held 53,000 hostage was actually an undercount of the thousands of people whose voices were not heard. I can't prove empirically that I would have won, but we will never know because we did not have a fair fight. And yes, that pissed me off.
Okay, so, I mean, not conceding, which was a sort of glorious moment. I mean, what was that moment like in real time? Did you just decide you were never going, when you heard the result that right then and there you weren't going to concede, did you walk to that podium and just decide, this is it, I'm going to just not concede? Tell me about that in real time. What happened?
So November 6th, election night, we had been hearing for weeks about irregularities and problems, and then on election day, we were getting more and more calls. So by election evening, when a lot of candidates, rightfully so given the context for how they've been trained to think about campaigns, we had a lot of folks who conceded and said, yes, this person won, I give up. I did not. What we said is we knew every vote wasn't being counted. We knew that there were these irregularities in absentee ballots. We knew people were being held in long lines. We know some people just had to go home or go to work because they were missing half a day's pay. And if you make $12 an hour, that can be, your car note, your rent. It's a big deal. So on November 6th, we said we're not going to concede because we need to make sure every vote is counted. In the next 10 days, we received more than 50,000 phone calls from people who face voter suppression. If 50,000 people call, that means 50,000 additional people didn't know they could call, and another 50,000 people just thought it was their fault. So that's a lot of folks who were disenfranchised. And so by the time we got to November 16th, after this 10-day period, I knew as a matter of law, we did not have a viable option because the law itself allowed this to happen. Policies permitted him to bastardize an election and manipulate a system. And so I acknowledge the legal outcome of the election. But concession is something very different. And as a democracy, when we concede, when we say it's okay to strip voters of their voices, when we say it's okay to tell people that you're not wealthy enough to be treated equally, those are things that change our democracy and corrode our trust. And so for me, the decision was very easy. I could not say the word I concede. My friend asked me about it. He was like, are you going to concede? And I literally could not say it back to him. And when I couldn't say it to him, I was like, I probably am not going to be able to say it to the world. So I wrote a speech. And in that speech, I acknowledge. I acknowledge that he is the governor. I acknowledge that the process unfolded in this way. But I will never say that the process that denied people their right to vote is true and fair and proper. And then I launched an organization called Fair Fight Action so I could sue him.
Fabulous. I love it. So tell us about the seeds of your first activism. Because I read that it was the 1992 acquittal of the Los Angeles police officers who charged with the beating of Rodney King. How old were you at that time?
So I was 18 when the Rodney King riots happened. Now, I will say my parents my mom was a librarian, my dad was a shipyard worker. They were Methodist ministers by the time this happened. But they were always activists. They were both involved in the civil rights movement. My dad got arrested signing people up to vote. My mom was smarter and didn't get caught. But writ large, they raised us to believe that you don't just see problems, you're responsible for engagement. They did not want us going to jail, but they said, do what you think is right. And for me, the Rodney King riots were important because in Atlanta, the African-American mayor, this legendary figure, tear-gassed our college campuses because there's a set of black colleges that sit right next to what used to be some of the oldest housing projects in Georgia. And he tear-gassed us all. We were treated exactly the same. And what that reminded me of is that the privilege of education does not transmute what people might see as these intrinsic qualities or bad qualities. And so it was my responsibility to speak up for all of us. And I worked with a number of fellow students. We did a silent march. That didn't have the effect I wanted. And then I was invited to have a conversation with the mayor. It turned into a bit of an argument. And he, to his credit, he listened. And a few months later, invited me to become the first student employed by the newly created Office of Youth Services for the city of Atlanta.
Wow. And that really kind of launched you into a political career. You recently lost your grandmother, who I know meant a tremendous amount to you. Tell me a bit about her.
So my grandmother, her name was Wilter May. They called her Bill. She was my dad's mother. My grandfather died a decade ago, actually, or died in 2011. My grandmother was the last of my grandparents, and so it was very hard. She lived with my mom and dad for the last 7 years, and she had this very forthright way of talking about the world. She does not like Donald Trump, and she was very angry with Brian Kemp. And so she told me the story the last time I saw her after Christmas. She talked to me before my election about the fact that she almost didn't vote the first time she was allowed to in 1968 because the other times she had tried to register and tried to vote, they sicked dogs on her. They fired her, they sprayed her with fire hoses. And by the time the right to vote became real in Mississippi, she was just terrified. And so she had decided not to vote. My grandfather took her to task and said, your sons, your daughters went to jail for this. Your children have fought for this right, that they are too young to enjoy. You owe this to them. And I remember her holding my hand saying, she was so ashamed of herself for being afraid to vote. But she was so grateful that she had a granddaughter who had a chance to actually possibly become the first black woman to be a governor in the history of the United States. And being from the South, she understood how important governors are, that it was the governors of the southern states that created and implemented and maintained Jim Crow. It was the governors who authorized the treatment of black people as less than human. And she wanted to see that happen, and when it didn't, she was madder than I was. And so, right before she passed away, she just told me she was going to be watching me, and that she wanted me to make sure I didn't stop and didn't stop fighting.
No, it's beautiful. So, I love what you said in your book, which, by the way, is a really interesting process book, really, about how to try and find a goal and succeed. You said, let your haters be your motivators, which is such a great slogan. What have been the toughest times for you? How many sort of haters have you had to overcome?
We don't have that kind of time. Probably the most salient one, there are two examples. One was when I was running for governor. I called friends who had helped me run for office before, who'd been there when I was doing the work at the Capitol. And, when you're starting a campaign, you have to raise money. And so you're supposed to call your friends and family first. And I'm calling these friends who know me, know my work, have been encouraging me to do more. But when I told them I was running for governor, it was this repeated phrase where they would say, oh, you're the smartest person. We think you're so capable, but you're a black woman. And they were whispering a diagnosis of terminal illness to me. And I'm like, yeah, I've been that for a while. You may have noticed. But what came after was essentially that their faith in me stopped at the water's edge because they could not see my capacity for leadership beyond this narrow confine that they'd set for me. And those are the ones who are more concerning. The people who just dislike me, the ones on Twitter who have come up with many memes to describe my diastema, the gap in my teeth, and who have pointed out that I am not I'm not the physical phenotype they're used to seeing. I don't care about them. It's the people who should know better that are the ones who whisper to you, well, are you sure you're capable of that? Or you might want to aim lower. The people who should know better, those are the haters that you have to really respond to, because those are the ones who winnow away at your confidence, who chip away at what you believe you're capable of. And so part of the goal of the book is to say, listen to them and hear what they say and reject it. Because sometimes there might be a kernel of a good idea in there if they say, well, I'm not sure you can do it because you don't like speaking to people. Okay, well then practice speaking to people so you can prove them wrong. That's the goal. But don't internalize their lack of faith and trust in you, because that's the part that makes us sit still, or worse, go backwards.
You've obviously had this immensely supportive family, tremendously high-achieving siblings as well as yourself. And then there's your brother Walter, who struggled with addiction and served time in prison. And what did you learn from his struggles? Because he was the one in the family that didn't manage to kind of take these incredible teachings of your parents and make it work for his own life.
Yeah, Walter went to Morehouse College. He didn't, which is a very prestigious college that is largely populated by African-American men. Walter is brilliant. He is so smart. But Walter suffers from mental illness, and mental illness is often underdiagnosed, but more importantly, it is ridiculed. And when you have that combination of shame and lack of resources, people go untreated. That often, especially in communities of color, turns into drug addiction. And the access to resources are difficult. And my brother continues to struggle both with his mental illness and with drug addiction and with going in and out of prison. And what I've learned from him is the persistence of desire is not the same as the capacity to overcome. We often attribute people's failures to their lack of willpower, and sometimes the greatest, strongest will cannot overcome physical and emotional turmoil. And that's why you have to have support systems. I've also learned I can't fix him, and I can't will him into better. I can be there for him when he needs it. I can say no when I'm supposed to. And what he will tell you in his clearest moments is that it's his job. He's got to take his medication on time. He's got to make smarter choices. And that's true for all of us. The challenge for the rest of us is that you don't have the consequence of going to prison if you make a mistake. That's what happens when he messes up. And so it reminds me of my responsibility to own the space I'm in and to be incredibly diligent, but also grateful for the options that I've been able to build for myself.
Well, you were actually also very financially supportive to Walter and his family, and being financially supportive actually got you into debt, right? I mean, you also have college loans, and you've been very outspoken about debt, which is usually a place which people in public office don't really want to go near, right? Most people just don't want to talk about the fact that they owe money, right? And you have. So tell us about that and what has motivated that.
I owe money. So I've actually now paid off my tax debt, and I'm working my way through the rest of it. But here's the thing. I grew up poor. I made poor choices in college. I got into debt. I learned about things that I'd never heard about when I was in school. I didn't know that buying a $300 TV could cost you $10,480 over the course of 7 years. But I got myself out of that debt. I still owed student loans, but those just seemed permanent. And then, and then my parents got sick. They took in my niece. My brother struggled, and I had to make a choice. And I fundamentally believe that debt is not a shame. It's not a stigma. It's a reality for more than 3/4 of Americans. Because we have a system that says that you still have to do stuff even if you can't afford it. They don't ask you if you're poor before you get cancer. And you can defer tax payments, you cannot defer cancer treatment. When my niece was born, I didn't want her to grow up wondering if the lights were going to get cut off, if the water was going to work. My parents were Methodist ministers, which meant they had chosen permanent poverty. And I had the resources to make their lives and their choice to raise their granddaughter. I could make that easier. And for me, those are the right choices to make. But I'm still responsible. It's my obligation to make sure I pay my debts. And I do. The IRS didn't have to find me. I told them. And they were going to find out anyway. So I'm like, yeah, by the way, I owe you money. And I worked out. And so part of it is that we have to recognize that being in debt is not a shame. What we should be worried about is whether we are willing to take the steps necessary to help ourselves and to improve how we deal with money. But the last piece is it should not be a disqualifier for ambition. Being poor, being in debt, having fewer resources than others does not make you less. That's what we have to know.
Yeah. So true. So, Stacey, you are still single without any kids yet.
Noticed that. Yep.
Is that an aspect? Is that, do you think, an asset in the grueling life of a politician or not?
I mean, I don't have to ask permission before I do stuff, but I would. There are days I would love to have a partner. I'd like to have someone who's at home when I come home, and I can tell them all the things that made me mad that day. Telling that to Doctor Who is not the same.
Which is why maybe you write your romance novels.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, I wish I'd spent more time thinking about my personal life than I did. As I said to someone else, look, I was bad at dating, so I just didn't do it. I don't like doing stuff I'm not good at. So I was like, okay, I'm not good at this, I'm going to stop. That was probably not the right choice. And now, yes, I would welcome an opportunity to build a relationship, because I do think there's something you learn from having to share your space and share your soul with someone else, and that's not something I've done. And yeah, I would love to have kids. It's getting on in years, but I still have time.
So, you have these choices now. Running for the Senate, waiting and running for governor again, or joining this huge melee of candidates who are running for president. You've said you're certainly, of course, as qualified, even more so than many of the candidates running. Really, what is holding you back? It seems to me that you have this enormous drive and a huge amount to say, and a great passion for justice and fairness. What's holding you back, Stacey?
It's nothing that's holding me back. It's that I think you have to do things for the right reason and at the right time, not just because it's available. I call it a vanity exercise. There's some folks who wake up and they see that something is open and they think, well, I should do it because it's there. That's not how I operate. And often when you come from an outside community, you don't have that luxury. My responsibility is, number one, to figure out what it is I actually want now. And that's why I'm giving very careful consideration to the Senate. It's an important job, and I need to know if that's the job I should take. And if I decide to run for the Senate, then I'm likely not going to run for anything else. And so I also have to think through, what does it mean to say, this is the thing I'm going to do for the next 6 years, next 12 years, next 18 years. I also respect most of the folks who are running for president. And I want to see whether their approach to this campaign, this fight for the soul of our country, if they're going to approach it in a way that I think will actually yield the result we need. And that's why I don't think that there's an urgency to making that second decision just yet. I normally don't have these ruminations out loud. My life changed a little bit, so usually I just have my spreadsheet and I type in my algorithms, I do my memos to myself.
Yeah,
now I'm having this sort of public conversation with Tina Brown, which is kind of crazy.
Well, I thank you for ruminating, and I just want to say, come on, Stacey, put it in your spreadsheet, right?
It's in there. I just have to figure out if I move it up.
I feel you're edging ever closer, Stacey. Come on. Should she run for president?
I will take it under advisement.
You'll take it under advisement. Thank you so much. We have loved having you with us, Stacey.
This has been delightful. Thank you. Thank you all.